We also don't assess that the Russians have sufficient forces in the Belgorod area to be able to wage an effective campaign against Kharkiv Oblast. Any sort of offensive in that area of the theater would likely be targeting the much weaker Luhansk Oblast sector, where again there's only about 12 villages that prevent the Russians from having the whole province. We think that if the Russians do indeed conduct any kind of a major attack into Kharkiv Oblast, that would likely be a feint, potentially designed to pull away some strained Ukrainian defenders away from what would be the main area of attack for the Russian forces. But for the time being, Kharkiv seems to be relatively safe.
What about the targeting by Ukraine of Voronezh, where there is a military airbase?
Yeah. The Russians, of course, have a tremendous number of forces that they've arrayed within Russia across the border, including in Voronezh and Belgorod. You have a lot of permanent bases and military infrastructure that is in Voronezh. And the Ukrainians rightfully seek to degrade those and destroy them because as the border of the current conflict, the front line has in many cases become the international border, and the staging areas have become within Russia itself.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And today we're catching up with George Barros from the Institute for the Study of War, which has become a leading authority on the war in Ukraine. George is the Russia team lead and the geospatial intelligence team lead. George, welcome back to Frontline. Thank you for your time.
Kate, thank you so much for having me once again. It's good to see you.
And in the recent update, or a recent update by ISW, it reports on Russian claims that its forces are preparing to launch a new offensive in the coming weeks once the ground freezes in eastern and southern Ukraine. What can you tell us about those reports and how credible they are?
Sure thing. So as your listeners might know, seasonality impacts the way that fighting patterns happen in Ukraine. Fighting happens when the weather and ground conditions permit it. And in the winter, there's a decent chance that you'll get a good season for fighting once the ground freezes, the ground becomes hard, that previous fall mud becomes ice, and track vehicles can maneuver over it, and right before you get the spring thaw when it goes back to being mud. Right now, the weather forecast shows that it's going to go below zero and consistently stay below zero in late January, early February. We currently forecast that the Russians are likely setting conditions to be able to exploit that anticipated freeze in order to conduct a large-scale offensive operation. This would make a lot of sense to conduct this operation at this time. Unfortunately, since the Ukrainians were unable to achieve what they sought to do with their summer and fall counteroffensive, the Ukrainians have largely lost the initiative throughout the theater in Ukraine, everywhere except one place in southern Ukraine where they're trying to cross the Dnieper River. And of course, it is now an opportunity for the Russians to try to exploit their initiative and retake some territory. In terms of pattern of fighting, now is also a very logical time for the Russians to attack. Of course, at this exact same time last year in early 2023, the Russians conducted large offensives against Vuhledar and also in Luhansk Oblast. So this is all the factors and all the indicators are lining up.
And do you see any evidence of military repositioning or activity which supports these claims?
Yes. In recent weeks, we've seen the Russians reconstitute units. They've conducted some operational level rotations. They've decreased the intensity of their attacks since around New Year's, likely in order to rest some units in order to prepare for another major undertaking. And within Luhansk Oblast specifically, there's only about a dozen or so villages that the Russians do not control. So if President Putin seeks to create a political and informational victory to bolster his popularity ahead of his staged planned March 2024 re-election, he could potentially say the war is going well. Russian forces managed to recapture an entire province, which they previously claimed to annex. And so this could be one of the objectives for that particular Russian effort in Luhansk Oblast.
A Ukrainian intelligence official reported that Russian forces lack the necessary operational reserves to conduct simultaneous offensive efforts in more than one direction in Ukraine. Is that an accurate assessment?
We agree with that assessment, and that's been the Institute's assessment really since the last time we've seen the Russians attempt to do simultaneous offensive operations. We've not seen the Russian military have the strength to advance on multiple areas of advance ever since the first attempt to capture Kiev back in early 2022. Since then, the Russian military has had bandwidth constraints, so they've only been able to really prioritize offensive operations in one concerted area at a time, which is quite an achievement on the behalf of the Ukrainians. And we've not collected any evidence that has led us to change our assessment about Russian capabilities in the current short term.
Given that we don't expect Russia to conduct a full-scale mobilization until after the presidential elections, is this how we're going to see the Russian strategy continue with no major push on more than one front until after the presidential elections? And how likely is it that will happen after that?
Yeah. So this is a really great question, because could assume that the Russians would actually practice best practice, military practice, and know their constraints and operate based on those constraints. But unfortunately for the Russians, unfortunately for the Ukrainians, the opposite has been true. We've seen time and time again the Russians fail to learn from their mistakes, stretch themselves too thin, and attempt to conduct simultaneous operations when really they don't actually have the means to be able to do it effectively. Of course, as we all know, if we're watching the fighting in Avdiivka and Donetsk Oblast, the Russians have been conducting major attacks against that particular town and /city since October. There's a viral piece of combat footage that just came out the other day of an American Bradley beating up a Russian T-90 tank in the Avdiivka area. So the Russians are still conducting operations there. It's unclear to me that the Russians actually have the force necessary to be able to simultaneously attack in Luhansk Oblast and Avdiivka. However, currently it appears that they are setting up to do exactly that thing. And of course, if they're unable to do one, then they try to do both, and they're more likely to fail at both.
So what will the cost be to Russia if they try to do both?
If they attempt to do both, they might be able to brute force some tactical gains at tremendous loss of equipment and loss of human life, which of course is not particularly a particularly effective way of waging the war. So the Russians might be able to generate some informational gains, but at a certainly higher price than they normally should have paid. And of course, that systematic attrition of the Russian military is good for the Ukrainians, as it further opens the prospects for the Ukrainians to be able to still win this war when the Russians are waging it poorly.
And how well prepared is Ukraine to defend itself and push back against a new Russian offensive?
That's a great question. As you know, the Institute does not study Ukrainian capabilities in the same depth at which we collect and study on the Russians. We don't collect on our allies. So we don't have any concrete indicators. However, if past performance is any indication, I would say I would expect the Ukrainians to be able to successfully defend these Russian attacks. They did the same in winter 2023 at this same time. Avdiivka still has not fallen. And the Ukrainians obviously are also warning about this anticipated attack, so they are not going to be surprised when the Russians conduct it.
Quite a big win for Ukraine in recent days has been the shooting down of this A-50 long-range surveillance aircraft over the Sea of Azov and the damaging of the IL-22 airborne command post aircraft. What does that do to Russian capabilities?
Yeah, it degrades Russian capabilities in the air domain because those aircraft might have been helping survey Ukrainian air objects. They could also be helping with coordinating the command and control. And it's a high value asset. The Russians only had a handful of such A-50 planes. Ukrainian officials allege that the Russians only had about, if I remember correctly, but six of them. So losing one can constitute, up to 20% of the loss of that sort of high-end capability. It will degrade their overall effectiveness, and it makes me curious whether or not the Ukrainians specifically targeted that airframe right as the Ukrainians are preparing to, in the near future, deploy F-16s. Perhaps they want to degrade the Russians' ability to surveil the airspace as the Ukrainians seek to employ that system in the near future.
And will the impact be on aviation operations solely, or will it have any particular impact on the ground?
It can also have effects on the ground. Those stations, those systems are capable of collecting on a variety of Ukrainian indicators, a variety of Ukrainian forces. And of course, because it's such a rare asset, it's quite a big blow for the Russians across multiple domains. But more importantly, arguably, than the actual airframe itself are the operators, the crew that was inside the plane. I mean, when you have those radio operators, they are specially trained technicians, specially trained professionals, of which there are a limited number. And so in many ways, losing the personnel who know how to read the radar signals, operate that specialized machinery, that's a really big loss for the Russian military. And of course, you need those guys to train the next guys. So honestly, in a lot of ways, losing the men was just as important, if not more important, than the hardware.
On the ground, Ukraine appears to be making good on Zelensky's promise to take the war to Russia, with reported drone attacks in Voronezh and also in Belgorod. The latter has reignited Russian nationalists to call for this major offensive in Kharkiv to create a protective buffer zone to protect Russia. What do you make of the strikes at the moment that have been conducted on Kharkiv? Are they retaliatory, or are they preparations for something bigger?
They're likely retaliatory. A lot of the strikes that we've documented in Kharkiv have been against confirmed civilian targets, such as a prominent hotel where a lot of international journalists had been previously staying, a gynecology hospital, gynecology clinic, a variety of targets that would not make any substantial difference to support a military operation. We also don't assess that the Russians have sufficient forces in the Belgorod area to be able to wage an effective campaign against Kharkiv Oblast. Any sort of offensive in that area of the theater would likely be targeting the much weaker Luhansk Oblast sector, where again there's only about 12 villages that prevent the Russians from having the whole province. We think that if the Russians do indeed conduct any kind of a major attack into Kharkiv Oblast, that would likely be a feint, potentially designed to pull away some strained Ukrainian defenders away from what would be the main area of attack for the Russian forces. But for the time being, Kharkiv seems to be relatively safe.
What about the targeting by Ukraine of Voronezh, where there is a military airbase?
Yeah. The Russians, of course, have a tremendous number of forces that they've arrayed within Russia across the border, including in Voronezh and Belgorod. You have a lot of permanent bases and military infrastructure that is in Voronezh. And the Ukrainians rightfully seek to degrade those and destroy them because as the border of the current conflict, the front line has in many cases become the international border and the staging areas have become within Russia itself. The Ukrainians should strike those, and the Ukrainians are developing capabilities to strike those objects and have struck those objects. I anticipate to see those sort of strikes continue, especially as the Ukrainians are developing their own homegrown indigenous capabilities for long-range strikes. The Ukrainians, for example, are developing and are currently producing drones, kamikaze drones, with a range of up to 1,000 kilometers. Ukrainian volunteers are also working on creating their own drones that are jet propelled that they can mass produce in high quantity to overwhelm Russian air defenses. And the Ukrainians have made it clear that their intent is to take the war to Russia, to strike Russian military objects within Russian territory in order to help the Ukrainians liberate the territory at the front in Ukraine.
How important a capability do you think that would be in the war for Ukraine?
As the battle space compresses, as we've watched over the last 2 years of conflict, the staging areas are going to go further and further out and farther away. So during the Battle of Kiev, the staging areas in Belarus and in northern parts of Ukraine, those were closer, and the Ukrainians were able to strike those. And of course, when the Ukrainians went to go fight into Kharkiv in last September, those staging areas were in northern and eastern Kharkiv, and the Ukrainians could strike those. But now, if you look at the current front line, the space where the Russians are able to have all of their logistics, it's compressed, and it's gone deeper into Russia itself. And so it's increasingly important that the Ukrainians be able to actually strike objects within Russia proper. And I expect that if the Ukrainians are successful in driving the Russians further out of Ukrainian territory, then the necessary areas that the Ukrainians will have to target will increasingly include Russian territory. And of course, the Russians will seek to exploit this. The Russians will have claimed and will continue to claim that they find completely unacceptable any kind of strike against Russian territory. They will warn that they will use nuclear weapons, but of course, within the norms and means of international armed conflict, the Ukrainians do have the right to strike legitimate military targets within Russian territory.
Interesting that, that you say this is going to be a development. How much of that do you think we're going to see of those kind of strikes increasing inside Russia in the approach to the election? And what effect do you think that might have in terms of the public?
I don't have a good read on how many of these long-range precision strike assets the Ukrainians currently have in the pocket. I know they're currently developing them, and it's unclear to me when the Ukrainians are going to decide to employ them, and how they're going to employ them. They might use them in small quantities to try to poke and probe Russian air defenses to learn about how to effectively defeat them, or the Ukrainians may decide to go out and conduct large mass attacks to just straight up overwhelm them. And it's unclear to me which tactic they're going to pick. But it is going to become important, but depending on the development timeline, it's unclear to me if they'll do it before or after the elections.
And just want to ask you about the long form study that you're working on. You mentioned Belarus just a moment ago. It's about Russia's efforts to effectively annex Belarus. Can you tell us a bit more?
Absolutely. So I think what the Russians have done in Belarus is quite nefarious, and it's been underreported and underobserved for the last 3 years because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But we know that the Kremlin has a strategic objective to regain control over Belarus, but it's not chosen to do so with overt military force, but rather through a much more insidious campaign of what they call political, military, cultural, economic integration. Russia and Belarus have a supernatural national organization called the so-called Union State. And this is a structure that was created on paper in a 1999 treaty. And essentially, it is a federal structure that stipulates the fusion of the integration of Belarus and Russia into one federalized entity, complete with its unitary executive body, a unitary legislature, and a unitary judiciary. Over the last 3 years, the Kremlin has made substantial gains in trying to solidify this integration, to coerce the president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, into accepting Russian terms. And the Russians have successfully substantially increased their military footprint in Belarus. 5 years ago, the Russians did not have freedom of movement within Belarus. Lukashenko was always a staunch advocate of Belarusian sovereignty. He still is, but he's actually on the back foot now. But now the Russians have free reign in Belarus. The Russians have, of course, deployed tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus. They conduct a lot of training in Belarus. And Belarus, just by nature of its geography, is extremely important for the NATO alliance and NATO's eastern flank because of that strategic Solwaki corridor between the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad and Belarus, and where Lithuania connects with Poland. Now that the Russians have successfully achieved freedom of movement within Belarus and are working slowly but quite effectively at de facto making Belarus become a Western government of Russia, the prospects for Belarusian sovereignty are increasingly becoming quite dim. And unfortunately, we all remember the 2020 protests when the brave Belarusian opposition decided to rise up against Lukashenko and in order to restore legitimate democracy in Belarus. And unfortunately, their prospects, if the Kremlin is successful in annexing it, the prospects of any free and fair democracy in Belarus are quite blight.
And what is the focus exactly of your study? Are you trying to work out what the consequences will be for NATO, or is it more about how we got to where we are?
My paper studies and assesses the Russian objectives for their integration efforts, where they seek to take the integration. What does the Kremlin's desired end state look like? I then assess the current progress that the Kremlin has made, where the different political, military, and economic integration lines of effort stands, sort of in terms of what they've gotten, what they seek to achieve, and then I lay out some of the implications for NATO. And the bottom line is that the Russians have made tremendous gains in Belarus, and it requires a fundamental rethink in NATO's defense requirements for deterring a Russian attack on NATO's eastern flank, and if necessary, what it would take to defeat a Russian attack on NATO's eastern flank.
The ISW has also looked at how Russia may also be preparing for attacks on countries other than Ukraine. Can you explain what is happening in the Baltics, in particular Latvia?
Sure. We've seen the Russians and Russian President Vladimir Putin in particular in recent days intensify rhetoric about supposed mistreatment from Baltic countries against Russian ethnic or Russian-speaking minorities within those countries. And of course, this is very important because Putin has specifically used these arguments in order to manufacture his justifications for war against many states in the former Soviet space. It happened in 2008 with Georgia. This was, of course, the crux of his argument about why the Russians had to intervene in Ukraine in 2014 and then again in 2022. And Putin has constantly tried to trivialize the sovereignty of the Baltic states. He refers to those lands as essentially part of Russia's historical lands, or as part of the place where there are Russian comrades abroad that need protecting. And he's explicitly stated about how the former Russian Empire, the former Soviet Union, this is all part of the so-called Russian world, the Ruski Mir. He gave a really big speech late last year outlining his concept of Russian identity, which actually transcends being ethnically Russian. It has to do whether or not you feel a kindred spirit to the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire. You live on these territories that the Russians used to control. So we've seen no specific indicators that the Russians have the capacity now to wage war against the Baltic states, or that there's any indication that they seek to do so in the immediate future. But it's very alarming to see the Russians spin up these information operations that they've used to then later attack other states. And of course, such a process is always a long run. The Kremlin began running its information operations about ethnic Russians in Ukraine in the 2000s, only to then conduct their first attack in 2014. So it's quite alarming.
Where else do you see them looking to spin these ethnic Russian protection messages?
Yeah. Part of the former Soviet Union and the former Russian Empire is also, of course, Central Asia. In recent days, we've seen Russian nationalists increasingly complain about how Kazakhstan has been attempting to, in the Russian framing, destroy its own previous self-identity by reasserting the prominence of the Kazakh language as opposed to the Russian language. There have been recent efforts to try to rename, I think, bus stops and railroad stations within Kazakhstan into Kazakh language names as opposed to historic colonial Russian names. And the Russians have really reacted quite vehemently against that. Kyrgyzstan, another Central Asian state, they recently abandoned Russian Soviet-style hard science mathematics textbooks, and then they instead adopted textbooks published by, I believe, Cambridge University. And Russian nationalists also saw that as an anathema as well. So the Russian claims pertain not only to Eastern Europe, but to the previously Russian-occupied areas of Central Asia as well.
And just to look at the war in Ukraine, what are you expecting in the coming months? Is it about I know that the Institute for the Study of War is now focusing very much on as well on Ukraine's efforts to build its industrial base and develop that. Is it about the race to resupply and keep the supplies of weapons coming for as long as possible and make it very sustainable for Ukraine?
Yeah, I think the Ukrainians understand that right now they're waging a long war, and that this war will likely continue for many more years. They understand that their Achilles heel currently is the propensity for the Western coalition to be prepared to continue supporting Ukraine in the long run. Of course, there's a giant policy debate right now in Washington about whether or not to continue funding and supporting security assistance for Ukraine. And even if we do pass the current spending bill, which is up for consideration, it's unclear that the United States will do so next year, the year after that, and so on and so forth. So the Ukrainians have a strategy, and their strategy is predicated on reinvigorating and building out Ukraine's domestic capability to produce weapons at scale. All manner of weapons, artillery ammunition, fighting vehicles, large guns, small arms, body armor, food rations, etc. The Ukrainians are building this up within the physical territory of Ukraine, but they are also, quite importantly, building up through joint production cooperation agreements, a defense industrial base based within NATO states in Central and Eastern Europe. Poland, Germany, Czechia, and others are currently engaged in joint production of weapon systems with the Ukrainians. And of course, this is very, very important because we see now the Europeans really stepping up and getting serious about European defense. It's almost as if Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been a wake-up call for Europe, and they understand that Europe's atrophied defense manufacturing capacity is not capable of actually meeting the demands of a high-intensity war against the Russians. And of course, rebooting and restarting a defense industrial base, it's not something you can do on a short timeline. This is a process that takes months and years to fully spin up. So it's quite good that the Europeans, and including the Ukrainians, are doing this. And of course, as these capabilities and as this production ramps up over the coming years, that will alleviate the defense requirement on Ukraine for it to go to the United States and the UK and others to fund the lion's share of its own defense, which will, of course, off-ramp that and hopefully make Ukraine's long-term defense more sustainable. But of course, as the Ukrainians spin this up, it does require that initial high amount of investment to help kickstart it.
You could go one step further on Europe and its capability to continue supporting Ukraine with its supplies and say it's actually cleared out its military store cupboards. Russia, having spent the last 2 years developing a war economy and a conscripted population. At the Davos World Economic Forum, the chair of NATO's military committee, Robert Barros, said NATO needed a war-fighting transformation, that anything can happen, that the tectonic plates of power are shifting. What are you going to be looking for in your future analysis in that light?
Yeah, it's a very interesting statement. I think what we're going to be seeing is, de facto, the war that the Russians are waging against Ukraine. It's not one state against another state. It's increasingly becoming a coalition of dictatorships: North Korea, China, Iran, Russia, waging a war against the coalition of the free democracies with Ukraine, the United States, and Europe. It's unclear to see exactly how these coalitions are going to develop, but I expect to see the Russo-Iranian Sino alliance becoming more closely aligned. Of course, the Chinese have a keen eye on what's happening in Taiwan. The Iranians are waging a major proxy war in the Middle East right now that has now transcended the conflict that was happening in just Israel and Gaza. Now, of course, what's happening in Yemen. So these things are all connected. And these wars, I think, have exposed how unprepared the Western coalition is to fight against, to fight and deter and defeat these authoritarian threats. So we're heading into uncharted waters. And yeah, I agree. Anything can change.
George Barros, good to speak to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me, Kate. Always a pleasure.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. My thanks to our producers today, Louis Sykes and Morgan Burdick, and for you for watching. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now, or you can listen to Times Radio for the latest news and in-depth analysis, or go to thetimes.co.uk. For now, though, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.